All right.
We have a vocal owl today.
He
Yeah,
wants to be in on it, it sounds like.
someday. Except he's an enemy of yours, isn't he? They are not friends. So I'll leave it up to you guys.
All right, got 4 minutes.
4 minutes. Today's story is about a man who, despite the fact that he hasn't used his horses in 10 years, would not have considered them pets. So today's story takes on the complicated and controversial topic of what is a pet. Okay, it's not controversial.
Yeah, there's the farm view of it, and then everybody else's view, probably. I see an animal, and I'm like, that's a pet.
Is Orion a pet?
I think so. But some people raise rabbits for food and fur, and they wouldn't consider that a pet. You know?
Okay. Would not pet require some sort of ownership? So
Like-
who owns him?
I always tell the kids that everybody owns it.
Okay.
He's the community's bunny.
I would have said this is his job. He works
He
here.
is a working animal.
And if you're working, can you be a pet?
I'd say so. What about horses?
What about horses?
Well, people ride horses, and people would. I know some people would consider their horse more of a job asset. But for people, I have a friend who's an equestrian rider, and he had a really good
Hi, it's Lee Furseth. It's Wednesday, so here I am, the Headwater Science Center, and here's Orion. Boy, Orion has to be on the screen, doesn't he? As much as I'd like to think that the reason you're tuning in today was to get to see me, the truth is you tuned in to see Orion. That looks perfect. Today's story is Bonny's Big Day, and I want you to know that I'd like to dedicate today's story to Pet Zone. Pet Zone is right here in Bemidji. They are a strong supporter of the Headwater Science Center. If you think about the animals we have here at the Headwater Science Center, we get crickets and feed them to lizards. Our bearded dragons eat our crickets, but we feed our crickets to the tarantulas. We feed crickets to our frogs and toads. And so by the time we're done, we're thankful that we're able to have Pet Zone as a provider of those crickets. But we also have a saltwater tank here, and there's fish food that we get from the Pet Zone. And, well, we have some other animals, including Orion right here, and we get some things for Orion, as well as we have some birds, and we get the bird seed for her. Anyway, why am I talking about the Pet Zone? Because it has the word pet. In today's story, Bonny's Big Day, takes on the subject of pets. I was going to say it takes on the issue. You know, I don't think it's an issue. I just think it's a topic for conversation. What constitutes a pet? Is Orion a pet? Orion lives here at the Headwater Science Center. He's been here for about 6 years. Is he a pet? I mean, we are a science center. He lives here. Well, he works here. If you're working, are you a pet? That becomes the conversation that's in this story. Now, this book is by James Herriot, and if you've been tuning in, especially over the last month, you've heard me talk about James Herriot. The stories that James Herriot puts in these books were the setting is somewhere around 80 years ago. And James Herriot talks a little bit about these horses. There's 2 of them in the story that are the center of the story. He talks about these horses as having not worked for about a dozen years. So now we're back 90 years or even 100 years ago. And right about 100 years ago is the time that they were switching over from horses pulling machinery to maybe tractors pulling the machinery. And I suppose most of the farmers, just because they wanted to make sure that everything was going to work out just fine, kept their horses, but primarily used their tractors. Nowadays, well, I think it'd be very rare for you to find a farmer that was talking about using horses for pulling his equipment nowadays. But back then it was relatively common that a farmer would say that he used to use horses. And that's kind of the setting for this story. That James Herriot, a veterinarian, a doctor of veterinary medicine, shows up to take care of one of the horses, and Bonny ends up being, well, the main character in the story. So here we go. I think that was probably enough of an introduction into this book. So, and I'm going to hold the book this way, see how all that works. Orion looks really, really interested. And Orion's usually only interested if there's rabbits in the story. But today, I think he's showing some real interest because he wants to know more about this pet conversation we're having. Maybe he's wondering if he really is a pet himself. One sunny morning in early September, I drove to see old John Skipton at the Dale Close farm, since he had telephoned to say that one of his cart horses was lame. As I got out of the car, the untidily dressed figure of the farmer came through the kitchen door of the Dale Close. John always seemed to look like a scarecrow. Get it? Look like a scarecrow? Take a look at him. And today was no different. He was wearing a tattered old buttonless coat, which was tied round his waist with string. It's right there. His trousers were much too short, and he hurried along towards me. I could see that he was wearing socks of a different color. One was red and the other blue. So if you look real carefully, one is red, The other one is blue. His pants are short enough to be showing them. By working very hard when he was a young man, Mr. Skipton had saved up enough money to buy his own farm. With its handsome stone house, he had never married, and cows on the hill. He had never married, and because he was always so busy looking after the sheep and the cows on the hill, bringing in the harvest from the fields and picking the apples in the orchard, he had been much too busy to worry about himself, which is why he always dressed in such old clothes. See, I'm going to take my mask off. We're social distancing today, and our camera angle is all going to work well. I'll just take my mask off altogether. So anyway, he's dressed in his very old clothes. The horses were down by the river, he said in his usual gruff manner. Okay, so gruff is usually a word saved for when somebody is angry or maybe they're even grouchy. In this case, I would just tell you that the gruff is probably more about the fact that he spends a lot of time alone and he's just talking very little. So he says it in a gruff manner. We'll have to go down there. He seized a pitchfork and stabbed it into a big pile of hay, which he hoisted up onto his shoulder. I pulled my large Gladstone bag from the car and set off behind him. It was difficult to keep up with the farmer's brisk pace, even though he must have been 50 years older than me. So if you think about it, James Harriet's got a degree. He's a doctor of veterinarian science. This is during his first year or two of being a veterinarian. So let's just guess. Maybe James Harriet is close to 30, maybe a little bit younger than that. He's 50 years older. Now we're guessing that maybe this man right here is 75, maybe 80. And they're headed off with a load of hay over his shoulder. He's headed off down the hill. And he's that age. That tells you something, doesn't it? I was glad when he reached the bottom of the hill because the bag was heavy and I was getting rather hot. I saw two horses standing in the shallows of a pebbly river. They were nose to tail and were rubbing their chins gently along each other's backs. Beyond them, a carpet of green turf ran up to the high sheltered ridge. Orion was saying something there. Maybe tapping his feet a little bit, or maybe you're just doing a little cleanup, huh, Orion? This is a nice place, Mr. Skipton, I said. They can keep cool in the hot weather, and they've got the barn when the winter comes. At the sound of his voice, the two big horses came trotting up from the river. The gray one first, and the chestnut following a little more slowly and limping slightly. They were fine big cart horses, but I could see that they were old from the sprinkling of white hairs on their face. Despite their age, however, they pranced around old John, stamping their enormous feet, throwing their heads about and pushing the farmer's cap over his eyes with their muzzles. "Get over! Leave off!" he cried. Do remember that. James Harriet likes to put little tiny, let's call them secrets or tricks in the beginning of the book that he brings back at the very end. And I'm just telling you, hang on to that thought. That way you'll enjoy it when he does it at the very end. He pulled at the gray horse's forelock. This is Bonny. She's well over 20 years old. Now, if you're wondering about 20 in terms of a horse, that's pretty old. To be 20 and be on a horse, that's pretty old. Then he ran his hand down the front leg of the chestnut. And this is Dolly, and she's nearly 30. So this one's 30, this one's around 20. She's nearly 30 now, and not one day's sickness until today. When did they last do any work, I asked. Oh, about 12 years ago, I reckon, the farmer replied. I stared at him in amazement. 12 years? Have they been down here all that time? Aye, just playing about down here. They've earned their retirement. For a few seconds he stood silent, shoulders hunched, hands deep in his pockets of his old tattered coat. They worked very hard when I had to struggle to get this farm going, he murmured, and I knew he was thinking of the long years those horses had pulled the plow, drawn the hay and harvest wagons, and had done all that hard work, which tractors do today. Now he means today, like in 1940, maybe 80 years ago. So you'd even have to back up another 10 or 12 years to get to the years where these horses were pulling all those pieces of machinery. I noticed the dolly was a bit lame when I came down with their hay yesterday, he said. Luckily, I come down here every day. You mean that you climb down that hillside every single day, I asked. Aye, rain, winter or snow. They look forward to seeing me, bringing them a few oats and sometimes some good hay. I examined Dolly's foot and found an old nail embedded deep in the soft part of her foot. I was able to pull it out quite easily with a pair of pincers, and then gave her an anti-tetanus injection just to eliminate any risk of infection coming about later. Remember, this is the one he's treating, and this one's named Dolly. This one is Bonny, and Bonny is the central character of the story, even though we've hardly talked about her. Climbing back up the hill, I couldn't help thinking how wonderful it was that old John had made that long journey to see the horses in all weather every day for 12 years. He certainly loved those great animals. A thought struck me, and I turned to him. You know, Mr. Skipton, it's the Derby show next Saturday. Okay, show, the Derby show. Now in Bemidji, I think they wouldn't say the word show. I think they'd say the word fair. It's the Beltrami County Fair next week. Isn't that when you maybe would see horses and cows and all those things all in a central location, the Beltrami County Fair? But back then they called it a show. It's the Derby show next Saturday. You should enter the mares in the family pets class. I know they are asking for unusual entries this year. Perhaps you should only take Bonny, since Dolly's foot will be a bit sore for a few days. The farmer frowned. You get frowned? Go ahead, frown a little bit. You frown a little bit. Yeah, he's going to disagree with James Harriet, and he frowns. What on earth are you talking about? Go on, I said. Take Bonny to the show. Those horses are your pets, aren't they? Pets, he snorted. You couldn't call one of those great big clodhoppers a pet. I've never heard of anything so silly. When he got back to the farmyard, he thanked me gruffly, gave me a nod, and disappeared into his house. The following Saturday, it was my duty to attend Derby show as the vet in charge. I'd spent a pleasant time strolling around the showgrounds, looking at the pets and the cattle and the sheep, the children's ponies, the massive bulls, and the sheepdog trials in the neighboring fields. Then over the loudspeaker came the following announcement. Would the entrants for the family pets class please take their place in the ring? Kind of looks like the Beltrami County Fair, doesn't it? Could be, albeit this is 80 years ago. I was always interested in this event, so I walked over and stood by the secretary who was sitting at the table. Now, this is the secretary who's sitting at the table near the edge of the ring. He was Derby's local bank manager, a prim little man with rimless spectacles and a pork pie hat. I could see that he was pleased at the number of entrants now filing into the ring. He looked at me and beamed. Beamed in this case is another word for smiled, so he's really happy. He's beaming. They have certainly taken me at my word when I asked for unusual entrances this year. The parade was led by a fine white nanny goat, which was followed by a pink pig. Apart from numerous cats and dogs of all sizes and shapes, there was a goldfish in its bowl and at least 5 rabbits. Hey, did you hear that? 5 rabbits are in the store. Hey, we're celebrating now. Clearly, Orion is happy to hear that 5 rabbits were in the pet show. There was a parrot on a perch and some bungees having an outing in their cage. Then an exciting buzz of conversation. A man walked into the ring with a hooded falcon on his wrist. Well, you probably know, you guests and visitors of the Headwater Science Center, we have a relative of a falcon here. He's called a merlin, and our merlin would be in that class of falcons. And yes, we take our raptors, and very much like that, our raptors sit usually on the arm of Angie. Splendid, splendid, cried Mr. Secretary. But then his mouth fell open and everyone stopped talking at the most unexpected sight, as the most unexpected sight appeared. I'm going to take a little time out from the story to tell you my own little story. So when I was a wee lad, in keeping with how this story talks about boys, when I was a wee lad, I lived in Thief River Falls. And one year, Thief River Falls decided to have a pet parade. It was probably a part of the county fair. I don't remember that part. All I know is that I was in the pet parade. And we had just recently had a little puppy born, and I was carrying the little puppy. I don't know, maybe a few weeks old. Now, I don't know why I got second place, but that's the place I got. My guess is it wasn't because I was terrifically cute. And it could have been because the puppy was really cute, but I do remember he licked my face the entire parade. Let's 5 or 6 blocks. My face was probably a bit red and a little roughed up by the time the parade was over, and maybe that's why I got second place. Now, if you're listening closely to my story, you're going, well, who got first? That would be important, wouldn't it, to my story? My brother Dale got first place. He's 2 years older than me, so maybe he was 6 or 7 or 8 at that time. And he got first place. He was carrying his ducks. We raised ducks for a variety of reasons, and he was carrying one of his ducks, and he got first place. That's what I thought of when I got to this page and I saw the lineup. I was thinking back to that pet parade that I was in. Oh, well, we won't try to speculate how many years ago that was. Old John Skipton came striding into the ring, and he was leading Bonny. But it was quite a different man and horse than I had seen a few days before. John still wore the same old tattered coat with string holding it together. But today I noticed that both of his socks were the same color. And on his head, perched right in the very center, was an ancient bowler hat. It made him look almost smart. They don't mean smart like intelligent. They mean smart like handsome. He was almost smart, but not as smart as Bonny. She was dressed in her full show regalia of an old-fashioned cart horse. Her hooves were polished and oiled, and long feathery hair on her lower limbs had been washed and fluffed out. Her mane, tail, and forelock had been plaited with green and yellow ribbons, and her coat had been groomed until it shone in the sunshine. She was wearing part of the harness from her working days, and it too had been polished, and there were little bells that hung from the collar. All right, so let's see if we can find the little bells that are hung straight from the collar. And this time I'm gonna hold it up really nice and close. Do you see them right there? Maybe you'd say that was right up on that saddle that's right there. So she's really dressed all out. It quite took my breath away just to look at her, says James Harriet. Now, if you take a look at his face, he is no longer beaming, is he, Mr. Secretary? He's not beaming. In fact, take a look at his finger. You know what he's doing, right? Mr. Skipton, you can't bring that great thing in here. This is the class for my family pets, cried Mr. Secretary, leaping up from his chair. Bonny is my pet, responded the farmer. She's part of my family, just like that old goat over there. Are you wondering? Are you agreeing? Are you disagreeing? You can see the argument that's going on here. What about the goat? I would have said, what about the falcon? That's what I would have said. But I was wondering about which animal he would compare to. What about that goat over there? Well, I disagree, said Mr. Secretary, waving his arms. You must take her out of the ring and go home. Old John Skipton put on a fierce face, and he glared at the man. Bonny is my pet, he repeated. Just ask Mr. Harriet. I shrugged my shoulders. Perfectly true. This mare hasn't worked for over 12 years and is kept entirely for Mr. Skipton's pleasure. I'd certainly call Bonny a pet. But, spluttered Mr. Secretary. Then he sat down suddenly on his chair and sighed. Oh, very well then. Go ahead and get into line. Did you hear that? Bonny gets to be in the show. So, John turned and led Bonny to a place right in the middle of the other competitors. On one side, there was the little pink pig. On the other side, a tortoise. It was a most curious sight. Ooh, there's the rabbit. See him? There's the rabbit right there. I guess that proves it. Rabbits can be pets. The task of judging the pets had been given to the district nurse. There she is. Who was very splendidly dressed, official uniform, to give her just a stronger sense of authority. Judging this class was often difficult, and when she looked along the line and kept seeing the great horse, she knew it was going to be very difficult indeed. She looked carefully at every competitor, but her eyes always came back to Bonny. All the rabbits were very sweet. Oh, how do you like that, Orion? All the rabbits are very sweet. The falcon was impressive. The dogs were charming, and the piglets were cute. But Bonny was magnificent. First prize to Mr. Skipton and Bonny, she announced, and everyone cheered. So, for all of you that are familiar with fairs and shows, yep, there's often a ribbon that gets placed for first place, and that's what's happening right now. As the rosette was presented, a man came to take a photograph for the local newspaper. It looked as though the great horse knew all about her prize as she posed there, dignified and beautiful. John, too, stood very erect and proud. But unfortunately, every time the photographer clicked the camera, Bonny pushed the bowler hat over the farmer's eyes. It was the mare's way of showing her love, but I couldn't help wondering how the picture would turn out. After the show, I went back to the Dale Close to help John undress Bonny, and I went with them down the hill to the field by the river. As we approached, Dolly came trotting up from the river, whinnying with pleasure to see her friend and companion again. Her foot is quite healed now, I said, noting the horse's even stride. In the gentle evening light, we watched the two old horses hurrying towards each other. Then for a long time they stood rubbing each other's faces. Look at that, said old John with one of his rare smiles. Bonny is telling Dolly all about her big day. Oh, wouldn't you know it? Bonny's big day reappears. And here's another one for you. I'll put that one up right nice and close. I told you, James Harriet likes to bring back something from early in the story. Bonny takes first prize in the family pet class, the Derby in Houghton Times. Thanks for listening today. Hope you enjoyed the story.